For today's video, we're going to be discussing the understanding the concept of time when it comes to playing through a game, and why the very best games differentiate between a 100-hour playthrough and playing through a game for 100 hours. One of the biggest changes to how video games have been designed in terms of pacing have been understanding how long to make a game. And this is a discussion we've had on several of our previous casts and with frequent podcast guests. But it's oftentimes one of the major stumbling points for developers that surely, if I make my game 500, 1,000 hours, 20,000 hours long, it will be an amazing game or be that much better. But as with so many games being released these days and time being more of a factor, it's important to understand the differences between kind of having a quality or quantitative experience versus a quality experience. And that goes back to the little expression I said at the beginning of this video. The differences between a 100-hour playthrough of a game and playing through a game for 100 hours. Now, for anyone here who plays JRPGs, especially from the 90s and the 2000s, you remember those games becoming more and more epic over time. It went from 10 to 20 hour long games to 40 to 60, 80 to 100. And when we throw in recent examples such as, or recent RPGs such as Skyrim, The Witcher 3, and so on, those games add up to a lot of time. And this is another major trend we see out of AAA games, especially those that follow the open world or open end model. Just Cause, Spider-Man, Breath of the Wild, Assassin's Creed, and again, we can name several more there. But the point and what runs into a lot of issues I have for these kinds of games is that they tend to focus more on the macro side of things. Again, more specifically on the hundreds or dozens of hours you're going to be spent playing it. That is not the same as focusing specifically on refinement and developing the core mechanics of a game. And this is why, for long-time fans, I tend to gravitate more towards independent games. Because even though they're not designed for 600, 1,000 hours of gameplay, I'm getting a very refined, very, I guess almost like a content pocket or a treasure trove of gameplay. And that takes me to our major point for today, and that's about understanding this kind of compartmentalization that I tend to see in the best video games. That these are titles that, while you can certainly play them for dozens and hundreds of hours, a single play of the game doesn't get anywhere near that long. And as you probably can assume for that description and the footage that you're seeing up there, that our go-to example of this kind of compartmentalization goes to the roguelike genre, or roguelite, action roguelike, or any other examples of rogue nature you can attribute there. But to be serious, roguelike games offer one of the best kind of packages when it comes to their gameplay. And we've talked about this before with how a playthrough of a roguelike is not meant to be a 100-hour long grind fest where if you fail at any point your entire character gets wiped. Instead, the very best roguelikes focus on a compacted game experience or playthrough that can be repeated but with more variance to it. Playing a game like Monolith over there, a single play can run maybe 30 to 50 minutes, give or take if I do extra stuff. Binding of Isaac could be about 20 to 35 minutes, unless I really go for the extreme difficulty stuff. And Slay the Spire, I think it's a good 40 minutes to an hour. Same goes for Enter the Gungeon. And we could kind of put these time limits on a lot of the roguelikes that came out over the last 10 years. But the point is that each time I run through one of those games, it is a different experience. And this is where this idea of supplemental content comes in that works really well for roguelikes and games that feature a more compartmentalized kind of game space. That I'm not adding 15 more hours to a playthrough. Instead, I'm adding content to mix up and change what can happen in the span of 30 minutes to an hour and so on. Now, we've spoken about this at length before, but there's more to this topic, and why, even though roguelikes are the best examples, or some of the best examples, we can see this in other genres. And being able to kind of, I guess in a way, again, lock down or provide like a small segment of gameplay for a player to enjoy. And again, this goes back to the topic of the core gameplay loop, because that's what we are essentially doing. We are repeating this core gameplay loop again and again and again because we're enjoying it. And one of the best examples of this is, of course, in the ARPG genre, where its core gameplay loop is fight enemies, get loot, sorry, not get loot, that's another thing, grow stronger. And that's it. Those three phrases are enough to keep people playing games like Diablo, Path of Exile, Grim Dawn, and so on for hundreds and hundreds of hours. And like I said, there is a difference between 100 hours of playing through a game and a 100-hour playthrough. With ARPGs, or with any game that has a really solid core gameplay loop, what you're doing only occupies a few minutes at a time. But those few minutes start to add up as you keep playing the game. And this is where that ever popular example of just one more turn from Civilization kind of comes from. That you don't sit down to play a game like Diablo, or Gaia, or Civilization, or Roguelike for like 5 to 10 minutes, or I'm just going to play it one time and then I give up. No, you play it and then you go, maybe I'll play it again, or maybe I'll try something differently. And suddenly, those 30-minute or 20 to 30-minute chunks of gameplay begin to add up, and suddenly we're at several hundred hours or several thousand hours of a game. We can even see this kind of compartmentalization when it comes to competitive games. Competitive games probably being the second best example behind roguelikes, because a competitive game, you are dealing with a fixed set of constraints for each match. 1-on-1, 4-on-4, champions, fighters, everybody having the same power set, cards, you name it. But when you are finished with that match and you go to play again, you're going to get a completely different experience because you're playing against somebody else differently, or they may be choosing a different character. So again, a fight in Mortal Kombat may take 2, maybe 3 minutes at a time, but those are very focused, very unique 2 to 3 minutes that can be repeated endlessly. And this is how these games work so well, and why, again, similar to roguelikes, that the very best competitive games, they're not designed around super long matches. And again, when we say super long, we're talking like hours. Because I know League of Legends is usually like an hour to an hour and a half at most. And that may be more the extreme examples of it. But it's kind of like watching, well, maybe not so much a good example when it comes to traditional sports. But for a lot of people who don't get like football, tennis, soccer, and stuff like that, it can be very awkward or very weird to watch them for 5 to 10 hours. And this is why a lot of sporting events are broken down into quarters or sections or innings. And again, I'm really showing off my sports knowledge here. But again, the point is that if you are able to compartmentalize what the player is doing into a very specific gameplay loop, and again, a very short one, you can repeat that if it's enjoyable again and again. So that while your game may take 100 hours to play through it, the player is not seeing that. And that's a major point. You don't want the player to be sitting there going, I need to play this for 600 more hours in order to make any progress. And that kind of immediate feedback is a major point about MMOs and their leveling and progression curve. And that is actually going to be our segue into the second part of this video, as we're going to talk about how games that aren't focus on a very short playthrough can still compartmentalize their gameplay loops and their progression to give it that feeling of constant progression. And there's our question before we end this part. Can you think of really good examples of non-roguelike or even non-RPG games that do a great job of motivating a player despite not having a very short gameplay loop? See if you can answer that and leave a comment down below, but we'll be back after a quick word to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. As we've talked about, some of the very best games do a great job of compartmentalizing their gameplay loops and their progression to make the player feel like they are constantly making progress and taking minutes at a time of gameplay and turning that into hours of a playthrough, as opposed to just telling the player up front, this game will be 100, 200 hours, whatever, to play. In order for this to be achieved, the player needs to understand several key elements. First, they need to know what their goal is. Obviously, whether it's beat a boss, collect stars, whatever. The player needs to then be able to figure out what do they need to do to achieve that goal. Whether it's collecting loot in an RPG, clearing a map in a tower defense game, you name it. And then finally, the player must be able to see and comprehend that they have made permanent progress. Now, that last point is very hard for a lot of games. For instance, with the roguelike genre, you don't really get too much in terms of permanent progress unless we're talking about games that have persistent elements to it. But we can simply say that for a roguelike, that is getting to the end of the game, getting the you win or the you lose screen. But for other titles, the player needs to be able to understand that what they're doing is moving the needle forward. And as we've talked about previously, that can be measured in inches or miles. In the last part, I brought up MMOs. And MMOs have been a really great example of this kind of compartmentalization. And one of the easiest ways to see that is with the simple fact of the leveling curve. At all times, the player can see at the moment's notice what their next step is in terms of leveling, how much experience is left, what is their current level. And leveling has always been used as a metric for unlocking new content and for changing or rewarding the player with new elements or areas. Now, some games don't go far enough, and we've seen some MMOs kind of have these lulls where you have to go up 5 or 6 levels before the next story chain gets unlocked. But we can even drill down further in the idea of collectathons, quest lists, bonus challenges, and so on. In the game Lord of the Rings Online, I remember they had an entire section dedicated to bonus challenges or things the player can do in each region of the game. This could be, complete all the story quests, collect, 5 Lord of the Rings, whatever. And what this does is that it gives the player a very easy to understand goal. It gives them what they need to do, collect the items, complete the quests, and once it's done, it is checked off that list, and the player will not have to repeat that specific area again. And this is why this kind of gameplay has become such a mainstay of AAA and open world style games. because many of these titles have very simplistic gameplay loops and systems, but they create a very engaging set of objectives or content to do, and then they can repeat that ad nauseum for each area. And then the player completes it, they can then they check it off, and then they do the next tasks. How many open world style games have, the towers we have to climb up, base raiding, collect whatever objects, go on races, and again, there's so many more examples of this. And again, the point is that the player is not thinking that it's going to take me 20, 30, 40 hours to 100% all areas. They are thinking, okay, what can I do in the next 10, 15 minutes? Can I go on a base raid? Can I complete this little story vignette? Once it's done, I can then move on to the next, and then the next. And again, suddenly these playthroughs just begin to balloon out of control. Now, with Mario over here, the 3D Mario games have done really great jobs of, again, compartmentalizing their gameplay loop into minutes at a time. Every few minutes, you get a new challenge. Mario completes that challenge, he gets a star, or a sparkly, or a moon piece, or whatever other MacGuffin you can imagine. Completes that, gets enough, we move on to the next bit of the story. But you can very well set a goal for yourself on each play of the game that I will collect 10 moon pieces, or I will collect 15 stars, or I will 100% this specific level. And when the player is able to set their own goals like this, it can help a lot in terms of keeping them motivated to continue playing the game. Another standout example again would be Gaia. And the Gaia games are really only as long as you make them. Do you want to play this as a 20 to 40 hour long RPG? You can do that. Do you want to play it as simply maybe 20, 30 minute chunks of completing missions? Yeah. If you want to play as a 500 hour min-max super quest of getting every character their highest rank and the best weapons, you can do that as well. It'll probably take more than 500 hours. But like we've been saying, the player is able to set a goal, they're able to understand what they need to do to achieve that goal, and they're able to make hard-earned progress that is never lost. And this just allows them to keep chipping away and allowing a game that may only have a gameplay loop of 10 to 20 minutes in bursts to turn into hundreds and hundreds of hours of gameplay. Now, for developers watching this right now, the key points that you should be taking note of is that you want to make your gameplay loop as short as possible while keeping the quality. Like we've said, nobody goes into a game to play it for 200-300 hours. But if you can make a 10-minute play of your game super enjoyable, something that people will want to keep coming back to again and again, you can then begin to see those hundreds of hours take place. And like we've said, you want the player to be thinking about the short term of the play, not the long term. Too many independent developers will tend to either front load the game and completely overwhelm a player, thereby turning what could be a 5 to 10 minute experience into something that feels a lot longer, or they'll backload it so much that the first 20 to 30 hours of the game doesn't really matter. Again, the quote-unquote real game begins at X phenomenon. The best games say, okay, play this game for 15, 30 minutes, make some really amazing progress, and then do it again and again. And maybe we'll give you something new later on, and that something new will add or supplement to the basic gameplay. And then suddenly the game just keeps the player motivated, and then those I'm just going to play it for 20, 30 minute plays turns into I've been playing this game for the last 4 or 5 hours, where'd all the time go? But with all that said, thank you so much for watching this video. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Be sure to check out our Discord and Patreon link down below, and we'll be back real soon for another discussion about the art and design of games. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.